can now open our book of praise, and we will read Lord's Day 35. It's on page 552 of your book of praise. Lord's Day 35 on the second commandment. It's Lord's Day 35. I'll start reading question and answer 96. What does God require in the second commandment? We are not to make an image of God in any way, nor to worship him in any other manner than he has commanded in his word. May we then not make any image at all. God cannot and may not be visibly portrayed in any way. Creatures may be portrayed, but God forbids us to make or have any images of them in order to worship them or to serve God through them. But may images not be tolerated in the churches as books for the laity? No, for we should not be wiser than God. He wants his people to be taught not by means of dumb images, but by the living preaching of his word. As for the Catechism. Brothers and sisters, in the annual series on the Heidelberg Catechism, here in this church, we're at Lord's Day 35. Lord's Day 35 is, of course, the second commandment. The first commandment is that you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, that you should have only one God, the true God. And in that commandment, we learn that the God that we serve is the God I am who I am, Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, now revealed in the New Testament as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There is no other God other than this God. And to many of us in our culture, this makes a lot of sense. Of course, there can only be one God. Even the Muslims agree with us on that. But this week, as we reach the second commandment, things make less sense. The second commandment, as we read, is, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. And I think it's fair to say, and especially to those who may be new to the Christian faith, this is somewhat puzzling. We're not always sure what the purpose of this commandment always is. Why not have an image of God? Why is this such a big deal? Why is this the second commandment? And today I want to explore this using a couple passages from Scripture as to why this is so important. The theme today will be Transcendent God cannot be reduced to an image. And that really is the point, I believe, of the second commandment. And bear with me as I walk through a few passages that prove, I believe, this theme. And as we do so, let's start with the overall picture of the Ten Commandments for a minute. Remember, the Ten Commandments are given in the desert of Sinai. The entire nation of Israel has been liberated from Egypt, a nation full of images to worship their gods. God liberates them from all of that, from crushing slavery, which they've done for centuries. And now they're in the desert, living for God. That's why it says in Exodus 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God is giving his commands in the context of grace. But it never comes to us, and I reiterate the point, it never comes to us and says, hey, you, get it together. No. God approaches and says, I liberate you. I save you from the thing that hurts you most. I deliver you from your sin and from oppression. I promise you eternal life now. Here is the path of life in the commandments. And if God is as good as the Bible says he is, and again, I want to return to the point. If God is as good as he says he is, then it makes sense that we should not serve any other gods except him. But how on earth is it a problem to make an image of him? The people of Israel, for example, we read in Exodus 32, they thought making an image of God was no big deal at all. In fact, it seemed that if you read the passage about Exodus 32, it seems that the people sort of thought they were doing God a favor. And I want to walk through some of this passage because I think the passage of the golden calf in many ways shows us the human sinful mind and how we think about God. It's fascinating if you read through this passage. We start in verse 4. They ask Aaron to make this, or Aaron says, take off your rings, we're going to make this golden calf. In verse 4 it says, he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. Now look what Aaron says next. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And so at first you think that the golden calf is Israel walking away from God. But that's not how the Israelites understood it. In fact, if you look at verse 5, it says, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And the Lord, the word for Lord here is God's name, Yahweh. So what's Aaron doing in the golden calf? Aaron is humanizing God. He's helping Israel worship God in a way that they better understand. Aaron is ironing out all the mysteries and complexities of God and making God comprehensible to the people. He's usefully borrowing ideas from other religions and using them to help Israel serve God. And here we begin to realize that the ancient Israelites weren't as foolish as we think. We think they're so foolish for worshiping idols. But in reality, the Israelites, like us, they knew that the idol wasn't God, or Baal, or Asherah. No. That image represented what they wanted most. And what they thought the God out there, how that God could be approached and served. The idol is a totem. It's a thing that's used to communicate and worship the God that they prefer. And in the golden calf, what is the golden calf? The golden calf is Israel's desire to worship God in their way rather than God's way. And more importantly, the calf is a way for them to become the master of God rather than the other way around. Worshipping God in Moses' way was pretty difficult. Worshipping the true God, as Moses defined him, required submission and humility, required a lot of mystery, a lot of self-denial, a lot of following rules that didn't really make a lot of sense all the time, at least to sinful people. So why not just reshape God's worship so that it makes more sense to us? And in verse 6, you see the consequence of this. Verse 6, and they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up, and listen, this is a little word, to play. What was that? This word, to play, is revelry, wild partying. And the rough partying, this word has overtones of sexual promiscuity, just kind of this mocking kind of partying. And then in verse 25, we kind of see this express itself later on. Moses comes down from the mountain and he says, and when Moses saw the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. And essentially, the people had gotten completely out of control, so much so that the people around them, presumably, were laughing at them, or thought they were foolish. And so redefining God had immediate consequences for how Israel lived. If human beings get to define who God is and how he should be worshipped, inevitably they will design a God that does not restrain their sin. A God who is not holy, because we hate being holy. And so by choosing, again, the calf is fascinating. What is a calf in ancient culture? Well, a calf is two things. It's fertility and power. A calf becomes a bull, which is the most powerful animal Israelites would have had in their immediate vicinity. And the calf is this promise of fertility. And what do humans want? Humans want power over their life, and they want fertility. They want wealth. And so the Israelites, by making the calf, are saying we want God's authority and his power, but we don't want him. And the calf allows us to have that very thing. And again, the calf is not a rebellion against God so quickly. They thought they were worshiping the Lord through it. I think today, in our day and age, we're not so different. I mean, few of us struggle with the first commandment. Of course, God's God. I mean, few of us are coming to the church on Sunday but worshiping Allah in the closet on the weekend. Is that really plausible? No. But the thing we do, especially as Reformed Christians, is say we serve God, but actually reshape him into the image we prefer. Every one of us is carrying a false image of God in our heart, an image that we prefer to the real God. See, the only way this false image is broken is by clear presentation of the Bible in preaching. If you don't listen to preaching, sooner or later, God will be redefined by your busy, idol-making heart. And these false views of God will have enormous consequences for how we live. We'll work through some examples. Some of us, we think God is somewhat like Allah, the Muslim God. See, Allah to the Muslims is far away, and he's aloof and forbidding and pretty judgmental and angry. And so to the Muslim, obeying God is everything. Love has no place in their worldview. And to the Muslims, the harsh Allah will only allow his people into this heaven that they have grudgingly, if the people work really hard to please him. And harsh Allah does not really care about anyone. You sort of have to pry out salvation from his cold hands. It's ultimately up to the Muslim to make his life work out the way it should. I think many Christians, we actually think a lot like that. If you think God is harsh and forbidding and you've got to pry out salvation with a chisel, well, what kind of life will you live? You'll grudgingly come to church because you have to, not because you want to. Church is a duty that bribes God into salvation. You're cold and judgmental in your relationships. Because if God doesn't really love you, then why would you love anyone else? Why would you give grace if God is not gracious? In fact, to you, grace and love make you suspicious. People who love you and are too gracious, something's wrong with them. They always want something in exchange, those do-gooders. Those of us who have harsh Allah God as our actual functional God, certain passages in the Old Testament make a lot of sense. You know, the judgment ones and the ones where God punishes Israel. We're always talking about how God's going to do that to the people we don't like. Those of us in this camp are busy destroying our marriages and our children as we speak because we don't love. Those in this camp have never met Jesus. And yet, you're serving God. But are you? You see, this is a second commandment issue. You have reshaped God into something he's not, and your whole life has been shaped by it. That's example number one. Here's another example. Another example is the type of God who wants the right theology but doesn't care about things like emotion, heartfelt faith, salvation of the lost, and caring about that. To this God, passing catechism is the main contribution we make. Beyond that, God's job is to help us earn wealth and keep us out of the hospital. If we do our part by maintaining our membership in the church, then God should do his part in making our life easy and filled with comfort. God doesn't need a relationship with us. He just needs to do the things that we need him to do. And it's good that he's gracious to other people. Here's the thing. If this is your God, if you've reshaped him to be this, then your life will eventually feel empty and pointless. This is why some of you have secret addictions. You will also become obsessed with safety and avoiding risk. Because you live for what God provides you, not for him. Losing his gifts terrifies you because that's what life is about. Prayer becomes about health concerns and retiring well, and instead of being a vital conversation with Jesus who knows you and who died for you, your Creator who lives in unapproachable majesty and glory. There's no glory in this kind of God. He's pedestrian. And he doesn't appeal to your kids, does he? What you need to realize, those who've reshaped into this kind of God, is that God is better than his gifts. The goodness of his gifts ought to lead us to him. That's number two. Number three, there's permissive God. A God that is gracious to a fault and puts up with anything I do. I can do whatever I want, and God's just going to bail me out. You know why? Because I'm trying to be a good person. God loves me because I'm trying to be good. Many who think this way imagine that believing the truth and studying God's word and learning who God really is, it's not important because God's just a nice guy. He's going to tolerate whatever I do anyway. He'll overlook my shallow beliefs and my mediocre involvement in church because I'm tired. If God is that simple, should we refashion God into a lazy version of ourselves? You think God is malleable and slippery and vague? God sits in blinding eternal light upon a sea of glass with stars in his hands. He casts sinners into eternal fire. Woe to you who think he's lazy and malleable and a marshmallow. Yeah, he's gracious and loving, yes. But you've never met that because you've never tried to meet him. You see, if you read the book of Proverbs, you see the category of the simple. Who's the simple? People who miss the point of the gospel because they're too lazy to look into it. No, God is gracious, yes. But first, he hates your sin. Now, these are three examples. Examples of second commandment problems. In our pride and the darkening of our understanding, Romans 1 and Ephesians 4, what's the problem with the human mind? The problem is that our logic is warped. We don't think clearly apart from God. And so when we decide who God's going to be, instead of going to the Word to reveal it, we create a God that's not the real God. And the effects of that are harmful and far-reaching. And you and I do not get to judge who God is and who he is not. We don't get to choose how we worship him necessarily. What parts of our life we offer to him in worship and which parts we don't need to. God is God. God is Lord, Yahweh. He created you. He directs your life. He offers you salvation, and it comes from him. You do not determine it. It says in Isaiah 40, verse 12, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Or Isaiah 4, verse 18, with whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? 20, verse 21, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy, spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught. This is the NIV rendition. He views the rulers of the earth as if they're puffs of air. How much more than you? This is what the second commandment is driving at, brothers and sisters. Question and answer 97. God cannot and may not be visibly portrayed in any way. He is too transcendent to be humanized. He is transcendent, infinite, incomprehensible, almighty, unchangeable, eternally timeless, and glorious. He cannot be molded into any image less than that. Even words can barely reveal who God is. And if you try to make a physical image of God, what you're doing is telling the world what or who you think God is. You betray the true state of your heart. The problem with an idol is once you decide to worship your heart's version of God, it may cost you eternity. Now, at this point, you may have a question. You see, to admit the true extent of who God is terrifying. That's why we talk about in the Bible, the fear of the Lord. To truly comprehend the magnificence of God is scary. You know, our lesser images of God are so much more comforting. And who are you, Pastor Eric, to take away our comfort like that? Well, you should know, as an answer to that question, that you're not the first to feel that discomfort. When Israel stood in front of Mount Sinai, when they saw the mountain smoking in the power of God, they were terrified. That's why they ran to the calf. Mount Sinai is covered in smoke. The mountain trembles violently. What would happen if that happened outside here? What would we do? They say, do not have God speak to us or we will die. And we should really be no different than ancient Israel. The fear of the Lord should be a starting point for how we view him. It's sort of like that healthy fear that you would have if you were taken into court. I've had this once in my life. You're taken into court and suddenly you realize that the consequences of your driving, for example, are pretty high. And you're terrified of the judge because this judge has the power of life and death over you to some extent. Shoot, I better behave in this room because that guy can do things to me that are not good, and he has every right to do so. Again, this is encapsulated in the second commandment. God is saying, if you think it's appropriate to make an image of me, you are in trouble. If you in your heart have come to the point where you think a caricature of God is better than God or preferable to God, you are not only mistaken, but in eternal danger. Don't do it. And not only that, but to make an image of God is to lie. Now, at this point, you might be wondering where this sermon is supposed to end up. What's with all the fire and brimstone? Boy, chill out, man. And you'd be right. It is fire and brimstone. This kind of teaching doesn't always make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, does it? There's actually a lot of comfort in this too. You see, meeting and knowing and worshiping Almighty Transcendent God should comfort us. If you begin to understand the true transcendence of God, then reading the gospel of Jesus Christ suddenly becomes infinitely more significant, doesn't it? That God sent his Son to die. If God is fun, fluffy God who doesn't care about sin, then sending Jesus seems like a pretty small sacrifice. Looks a lot like divine child abuse, as they say in the universities. But if our sin and our rebellion against God in the Garden of Eden is to offend him, oh man, would he send Jesus? Sinners in, Jonathan Edwards, the famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he describes in this sermon how every one of us is like a spider being dangled over a pit of fire. And the only thing stopping you from falling into that pit is a slender little thread. And at any moment, you might die. In other words, the thread may be cut, and there you fall. That is God's anger on your life. That's the anger that our neighbors sit under. And by our inability to tell them about Jesus, that's the anger that they will receive until we tell them about Jesus. And if that is our state, if God is so powerful that we'd never get to reshape an iota of him, then to send his Son to be one of us, to die, is astonishing. That we would be forgiven by this God, that he would have the kind of love for you, to give you that kind of personal attention, that God would suffer for you. Boy. And it gets even deeper. This whole business of the image of God is interesting because, and actually in debate with the Muslims, this constantly is coming up. What is the image of God? The image of God is you. We are created in the image of God. And when Jesus becomes a man, he is God and the image of God all in one. The best view of God, other than the Word, is humanity. We are the closest thing to the description of God that we could ever look at and see. And Jesus comes and he becomes one of us. And by so doing, he displays more perfectly to us who God is than anything that's ever come before. By walking as a man in perfect love, we see the love of God. We see the grace of God. We see the mercy and the compassion of God. We see the transcendence of God. We see the anger of God towards the Pharisees. And so by making an image that's not Jesus that we read about in the Word, we miss out on the actual image that we're meant to see. So God does not just show us love in sending Jesus to die. He shows us love in showing us who he is, revealing himself when Jesus comes. Why would we worship anything other than the Son of God who's become man? In Jesus, we see the fullness of God. And we can read this Bible as a description of Jesus and of God again and again and again. And every time you read it, it gets even better. The real God is so much better than the images we create. Jesus proved that. Wow. So the love of God is real. because a man walked on earth and he loved like God does. So brothers and sisters, the second commandment should drive you to Christ, because he is the fulfillment of this commandment. Don't make an image of God, because I've sent you one, and his name is Jesus. Go to him. Let him be God as he is, far better than your best caricature. Amen.